Hey guys, it's Jack. I wanted to let you know that we're starting a new push for subscriptions here on Human Events Daily. So make sure that when you're listening to this podcast, you hit subscribe, you download it, and you share it with 5 of your friends. Make sure they're all going and downloading as well, because we need to get the signal out as much as possible. Look, we've done so much over the past couple of years since this show started, and we're only going to do so much more. Let's get it. This is what happens when the fourth turning meets fifth generation warfare.
A commentator, international social media sensation, and former Navy intelligence veteran.
This is Human Events with your host, Jack Posobiec.
Christ is King.
This morning I'm thrilled to sign the Secure America Act to immediately and fully fund the Department of Homeland Security through the end of my term. So we won't have that to be talking about anymore, Lisa.
No, we will not, sir.
Tonight, raw emotion and tensions running high outside this Texas courthouse as word of the verdict reached the crowd. After deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury found the 19-year-old Carmelo Anthony guilty of murder in the stabbing death of 17-year-old Austin Metcalf.
Just a short time ago, Anthony sentenced to 35 years in prison.
The U.S. has resumed a series of military strikes against Iran.
It comes hours after a U.S. Army Apache helicopter went down when it collided with an Iranian drone.
U.S. Central Command saying on social media, quote, U.S. Central Command forces began launching self-defense strikes against Iran at 5 p.m. Eastern time today at the Commander-in-Chief's direction in response to yesterday's downing of a U.S. Army Apache helicopter.
As President Trump says, Iran's military is a complete and total mess. Much of it, like their Navy and Air Force, doesn't even exist anymore. They have been completely defeated. Iran is all talk and no action. The bully of the Middle East is dead. They've taken too long to negotiate a deal that would have been great for them. Now they will have to pay the price. President Donald J. Trump.
Protesters set multiple fires, including a bus ablaze in Belfast on Tuesday, after a stabbing sparked anti-immigration demonstrations because the suspect is an asylum seeker. A Sudanese man has been accused over a knife attack on Monday night, where the victim, a man in his 40s, was taken to the hospital with serious injuries to his eyes, face, and back.
The suspect, a man in his 30s, who we now understand to be Sudanese, was arrested at the scene on suspicion of attempted murder.
These people who are coming over here illegally, they're rapists, terrorists. They're coming over here. It's literally like putting a wolf in a sheep field. You are giving them a target-rich environment. You haven't vetted them. You've done nothing. All you've done is dump them in a place where they can wreak havoc. Where they come from, guess what? There's no law. If they do literally whatever they like.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard today's edition, Human Events Daily. We're here live on Real America's Voice. And today is June 10th, 2026, Anno Domini. Folks, what can I say? This is state terrorism against our people, against homes, villages, towns, communities. We talked yesterday about the near beheading in Belfast yesterday. It was 2 nights ago now. And later find that the man who was identified as Stephen Ogilvy is alive. He is in critical condition. He has lost one eye since it took place. And that means that his eye was cut out by a migrant there on the street, a Sudanese migrant. Stop pretending everything is fine. Stop pretending everything is fine. They're killing white people. They're raping white daughters. They're slaughtering white sons in the street while the police handcuff them and the blood drains from their fingers. There's another story out of Bristol in the UK right now. The jury's hearing all about it. 3 Afghans. They were going around a Christmas mall, shopping at Christmas time. They found a young girl, brought her home, gave her alcohol, gave her drugs, and then they took turns raping her for hours. hours. Then they fled. This is just today. The story is today going on in court. Nightmare fuel. Now, they fled the country because they knew what they did. They were later picked up in France. But that's never going to give her life back, her sanity back, her purity back. Carmelo Anthony got 35 years. But that doesn't give Austin Metcalf's family their son back. And this guy, he just lost an eye. And he wasn't fighting in a war. He's walking down the street. Or perhaps he is fighting in a war. Perhaps there is a war that's being waged. It's just that our enemies are using different tactics. They're using low-intensity conflict. They're targeting white people for a reason. Because they know, by and large, white people do not respond. They don't fight back. Well, maybe that's changed in parts of Northern Ireland. Because you see in parts of Northern Ireland now, they're joining together Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods that a generation ago were firebombing each other's houses. There's the Hatfields and the McCoys joining up saying, you know what, enough is enough. We can deal with all that later because we have a bigger problem, an external problem, a problem that faces each and every one of us because they don't view us as separate, whether it's different Christian denominations or different European denominations, different backgrounds. No, this is a fight for our society, for Christian society, for the Christian West. Will we continue to be the Christian West, or will we let our countries and our lands fall into this barbarism? Will Rome be sacked again? I guess we'll find out. Right back with more Jack Posobiec, Human Events Daily.
In our way, and our golden age has just begun.
This is Human Events with Jack Posobiec.
Now it's time for everyone to understand what America First truly means.
Welcome to the Second American Revolution.
All right, folks, Jack Posobiec back here, Human Events Daily, Real America's Voice. Real America's Voice, we're here, we're back. And folks, America's hitting its 250th anniversary. And we're fighting for its soul right now. It's culture, it's economy. Who gets our dollar? That is a big part of the battle, economic warfare. Now, most wireless companies, they don't care what you stand for. They just want your cash. But Patriot Mobile is different. For more than 12 years, they've stood with Americans like us, backing the Christian conservative movement when everyone else stayed silent or worse. Now, here's the deal. You don't have to give up quality or service when you switch to Patriot Mobile. They deliver premium priority access on all three major U.S. networks, so you'll get the same coverage or better than you have today. Think switching is a hassle? It's not. Keep your number, keep your phone, or upgrade. Their 100% U.S.-based support team can activate you in minutes. Still paying off a device? Patriot Mobile even offers a contract buyout. This is a defining year, the Big 2-6. We're in a fight for America's soul. We must work together to save our country. Go to patriotmobile.com/POSO or call them 972-PATRIOT. Use promo code POSO for a free month of service. That's patriotmobile.com/POSO or give them a call, 972-PATRIOT, and make the switch today. All right, I want to bring on Aaron McIntyre of the Aaron McIntyre Show. And Aaron, you're someone who, you and I have been talking about these issues for about 2 years now on this program and appearing on your show. Some people have said that the current reaction, this huge wave of reactionary activity that we're seeing to the murder of Henry Novak, the near beheading of Stephen Ogilvy, both in the UK, the rape of these young girls in Britain, all of this hitting at the same time, Carmelo Anthony kind of happening concurrently. Do you think that we are actually seeing a reckoning, a white reckoning, or perhaps is this going to just be a bunch of lead to a bunch of nothing?
It's hard to tell early on. I think it's very clear that we're getting the most powerful reaction we've seen in a long time. And of course, there's another factor that people haven't necessarily thought through. Northern Ireland is a place where the troubles are still in living memory. There are partisans there who remember what it was like to be in that type of environment, and so they can operate in a way that just random casual street anger does not. They can take on targets as they have, looking at immigrant housing, that kind of thing. They can operate in ways that just kind of normal unorganized street protests do not. So I think there is a possibility that we could be looking at a very different animal here. That said, the key is always meeting popular action with elites. It is very difficult for random unorganized street violence or protests to ultimately yield results if there's not some kind of elite cadre who ultimately steps up and takes leadership and uses that energy and momentum towards something. Of course, you have Rupert Lowe kind of leading an insurgent right-wing party in the country, but there are larger questions as to whether some of these more active street protests, or some would even say the riots that are being involved there, would they ultimately receive support from some elite sector in the country? If they can do that, we're looking at a very different animal. But if it remains just kind of scattered violence, then it could be the case that the government is ultimately able to suppress it, as they did after the Southport riots.
Well, no, that's a great point. But and I hear what you're saying, but at the same time, I guess I'm talking about even a larger trajectory here, right? This used to be 10 years ago that if you put out a documentary that said migrants increase the percentages of rape and sex assault far higher than any of the local population, you'd be banned from YouTube, which I know because that's what happened when I did that very thing up in Sweden. And you would just simply be stating facts about these cases that seem to happen over and over and over, that now suddenly we do actually have real big name, household name politicians and world leaders are forced to address them. So that to me speaks that on the larger trajectory, there has been a shift.
Oh, no. When we talk about the Overton window, that is most certainly true. I mean, I remember when Tucker Carlson, like 5 years ago, was desperately trying to pull the phrase anti-white out of people on Fox News. Now it's something that is said regularly by major media figures without hesitation. The understanding that there is now a direct and intentional attack on whites across the world has been made obvious. You simply can no longer deny it. When we look at the two-tier policing in the UK, when we look at the type of violence that is perpetrated against Americans in the United States, we can see often the amount of permissibility that has been granted by governments, by law enforcement, the cover that's been provided by media. And people are sick of it. We're seeing that even in places like the UK, where speech is heavily regulated, it's becoming more and more common for people to pick up these talking points, discuss these issues, talk very seriously about reimmigration, about mass deportations. The entire constellation of language around this issue has changed. The question is, can the rhetoric also translate into political change? Again, we've seen the surge, Nigel Farage using anti-white in speeches when he very specifically went out of his way not to invoke that kind of language. Previously, he recognizes that he has to get to the right or Rupert Lowe will outflank him. And so that's obviously a scenario where the language is shifting the policy and the rhetoric, but can it ultimately shift those political goals? That's the question. Can the progress that's been made in the realm of ideas and rhetoric translate into real political or kinetic change, depending on how things are going in the UK?
Well, and by the way, I'd love to paraphrase from the great philosopher Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., as I am wont to do, and I would just say that today a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that the West has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the working white poor has worsened over the last 12 to 15 years. That's exactly what Martin Luther King said in the 1960s. All I did was change a few words.
Yeah, there's simply no denying what's happening here. I mean, obviously, we can make the jokes all day. Fiery but peaceful protests are occurring right now in Northern Ireland. It's very obvious that the British have noticed that no matter how they vote, when they vote for Brexit, when they vote for conservatives, no matter how they vote, they keep getting more mass immigration, more two-tier policing, more discrimination against the native British, the whites in the country. It is very clear what is happening, and that there has not been a political solution yet. They have not been offered someone who has seriously addressed these issues, even when they've promised to directly. Many people will ask me, why don't the British just vote for someone who will represent their interests? And the answer is they did. And at every turn, they were lied to and betrayed and backstabbed. And so now that they have not been heard politically, they have gone to the streets. Of course, this is not something I would wish on them. I hope this is something that ultimately the British are able to avoid. But it looks like if the politicians will not listen, this is what's going to happen. Mass deportations were always the moderate solution. This can get much, much worse. And we're just seeing the first glimpse of what happens when these countries refuse to remove the illegal invaders that they imported to replace their native populations.
And yet we still hear that Keir Starmer, even though he's been forced to come out and make a few comments about this, that in fact, he is still pushing for more policies, more waivers, more visa programs, more credits for visas for different companies if they're requesting enough of them or something. It's full steam ahead, even though he acknowledges that the violence is occurring at the hands of these people.
Oh, it's even more insane. They won't even discuss banning the knives that Sikhs are allowed to carry when average British people are not. So as a citizen of that country, you are entirely disarmed. Forget a gun, forget a knife. You can't even have pepper spray. But aliens, people who are not supposed to be in your country, migrants, are allowed to come in and carry weapons that they use to murder your children because ultimately they have special privileges that you don't. Their foreignness grants them privileges that you don't have. So of course Keir Starmer is taking no action. He's still defending the rights of foreigners to carry blades and murder people in the streets. You can't get a steak knife in the UK because they're too dangerous, but a Sikh can carry a knife on his belt and kill you with it, and they won't even begin to discuss removing that privilege. This is insanity, but this is what we're talking about when we say the language of the unheard. They have not been provided a political solution, and they need a political solution because without a political solution, the only thing left is an appeal to heaven. And that is not a place where you want to be unless you absolutely have to go there.
No, you don't. And yet here we are celebrating the America's ultimate appeal to heaven from 250 years ago. We're just about to achieve that. Of course, remember that the appeal to heaven flag is also an extremely naughty flag. I believe it's also white nationalist. So we'd be very careful if anyone wants to show that traditional flag from, I think it was from Maine in the Revolution.
Well, to be fair, the SPLC has now been shown to be like buying all the hoods and robes for the KKK and supplying the burning crosses. So it's getting more and more comical that they've named things like the appeal to heaven flag racist. But yeah, that's where we're at, right? Like, obviously, we recognize as Americans that there does come a time where ultimately people must push back against their government if it has become unjust. Our founders were very careful to write the Declaration in order to lay out their grievances and why that severing of that political connection had to be done. They wanted to justify to the world why America had to become its own nation. The UK might be at the point. Obviously, it wouldn't break away from the government. It would need to replace the government. But at some point, it could reach a scenario where it also has to realize that those bonds are no longer healthy for the country. But as we say, hopefully there is an opportunity to work through a peaceful and political process. But when that's not provided, I ultimately cannot blame these people.
No, I certainly hope that occurs. Orrin McIntyre, where can people go to follow you?
Orrin McIntyre on The Blaze, on Twitter, and on Substack.
Thank you so much, man. God bless. Thanks for being here. Right back. More Human Events Daily.
You talk about influencers. These are influencers, and they're friends of mine. Jack Sovic. Where's Jack? Jack, who's done a great job.
All right, very excited to be on here now. Human Events Daily. This is Real America's Voice. And folks, let's put out a quick reminder, though. Father's Day coming up June 21st. And if you want to give your dad the gift of a great night's sleep, you can pay him back for all of those sleepless nights. And by the way, you know, we had a little bit of a situation last night in the Poso household. I'll tell you what it is that our ghost bed is so great that, in fact, little 5-year-old AJ wanted to crawl into bed, and he slept the entire night on the ghost bed with us because he goes, Mom and Dad, your bed is so much more comfortable than mine. Well, sorry, buddy. That's because we have a ghost bed and you don't. But folks, if you want to go out there and not be like AJ and have your own ghost bed, you could go and get one. It's family owned and operated. I don't know, maybe they do have kids' bed. I should probably look that into a little bit more. But I don't know. His behavior has been a little bit off lately, so we'll see. GhostBed has 3 generations of doing business in the United States. They are American made. And folks, you can get 101 nights to try GhostBed at home right now. And if you don't feel the difference, you can send it back risk-free. Right now, GhostBed is offering the Human Events audience their lowest prices of the season, plus an extra 10% off. Just go to ghostbed.com/POSO and use promo code POSO. That's ghostbed.com/POSO, promo code POSO. And remember, Father's Day is coming. We're very excited to have on our next guest, Zia Youssef. He is the spokesman for reform on Homeland and likely the next UK Home Secretary. We're so excited that he's here to join us. Zia, how are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me.
Well, and you've been out there. Obviously, the UK has been the forefront of so much discussion on this side of the pond. I'm sure you didn't realize that when you had this pre-planned trip over here, but I appreciate you being able to come on. Tell us, we see these scenes, Northern Ireland, we see the protests in the UK after the death of Henry Novak, that video that just took, I think, the entire world, the entire West by storm. What is happening within the UK right now? How do you describe this?
I describe it as an invasion because that's the dictionary. I mean, the dictionary definition of an invasion is an incursion by a group of people in an unwanted way. You know, more people have turned up on the beaches of the United Kingdom illegally without invitation than stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, for example. Then you can look at the people who came to the country legally. You know, if you look at what the so-called last Conservative government did, they shipped in 12 million people over the period of 14 years. Now, to put that into context, that's about a fifth of the population of the United Kingdom in such a short, I mean, basically in the blink of an eye. And then, you know, you mentioned the murder of Henry Novak, because one of the other things that's happened in the UK is the absolute, the growth of DEI to such a degree that things have gotten, frankly, extremely tragic. And as you'd have seen from that body cam footage, which you're right, has horrified people across the world. You know, when police officers turned up at the scene, Hampshire police, attending a scene, they'd been told that the murderer had been racially abused. And as the murderer and his family stood over poor Henry, who was bleeding to death, Henry said, "I've been stabbed." The British police responded with, quote, "I don't think you have, mate," and proceeded to handcuff him as he bled to death. And the last words Henry heard on this earth were his rights being read to him by a police officer. And then when we look at the reaction of the entire political and media establishment in the UK, it is the polar opposite of the way they reacted to the death of George Floyd. Whether it was the BBC, who ran program after program, created a £100 million diversity fund to embed anti-white racism into their recruitment processes, whether it's, you know, Keir Starmer himself taking the knee constantly. Now British people are being told, don't be angry about this. Don't concern yourselves with it. You know, it's just a one-off incident. When the reality is, you know, a poll came out just yesterday showing the number of British people who believe that there is anti-white prejudice amongst two-tier policing to the detriment of white people has doubled in the space of a couple of years. So there are manifold issues in the UK. We need to actually have a border. We need to uphold that border. We also need to deport everyone who has come to the country illegally, and that's somewhere between, you know, best estimates between 1.2 and 2 million people. We need to uphold law and order, and we need to show the world that once again, you know, Britain, look, it's not the power it once was, but I personally think, so I came into politics a couple of years ago, having been an entrepreneur, I think Britain does have the potential to be an extraordinary country again. What we need is proper governance.
And this is something where these issues, politically speaking, they've now been pushed to the forefront, where for so many years, you didn't really hear much talk about this. You heard about it in the U.S., but I never really heard much talk about it at the mainstream level in the U.K.
And the reason for that, so you're absolutely right, and the reason for that is the social cost. I mean, if you were a British person, I mean, let's take the grooming gangs, for example. You know, Nigel was talking about this a decade ago, and there was an enormous social cost that you pay, because the media would come after you, label you every possible pejorative. You know, you're racist, you're fat, you know, all of the words that you'll be aware of here, just for saying things that are demonstrably and obviously true. And, you know, the British people are incredibly welcoming, incredibly warm-hearted and generous. You know, they welcomed my parents to the UK in the early 1980s. My dad came with my mum as a doctor. But the reality is the patience of the British people is now exhausted. And look, time is running out. Time is running out. You know, if we don't get a totally different form of government within the next few years, my personal view is that the trends that we are seeing, the extrapolating of those trends would suggest there is no path back for Britain to be Britain in any recognizable way.
No, and unfortunately, these are some of the conversations that we've been having here in the United States as well. We looked at, we had a mayor's race in New York City. We just had this LA primary in Los Angeles. And in many of those cases, we're seeing that the way that so many of the migrants are voting is that they're voting for more extreme candidates in ways that folks who had been born there, folks who were traditional New Yorkers or Angelenos would never countenance at all. And, you know, let's take someone like Karen Bass, who presided over the burning down of half the city and yet faces no political repercussion for this. And so this is an example of where we can see the direct political ramifications in two of America's largest and greatest cities. Take a quick break. We'll be right back. We're on with Zia Youssef of Reform UK. He's here live with us on Human Events Daily.
Jack? Where's Jack? Where is he? Jack, I want to see you. Great job, Jack. Thank you. What a job you do. You know, we have an incredible thing. We're always talking about the fake news and the bad, but we have guys, and these are the guys who should be getting Pulitzers.
All right, Jack Sobick back live, Human Events Daily, Real America's Voice. We're here talking with Zia Youssef. He's from Reform UK. Now, Zia, I've got to ask you, you know, because I'm sure, you know, people will be watching, and you just mentioned in the last segment that your own family were immigrants to the United Kingdom. Why is this issue then for you something that you speak out about? Shouldn't you be, shouldn't you be promoting more immigration?
Well, that's very much the frame that a lot in the media in the UK take. There seems to be the sense that there's a limit to how restrictive an immigration policy one can advocate for if your own parents are migrants. But look, when my parents came to the country, my dad had just qualified as a doctor. They're originally from Sri Lanka. Net immigration to the UK was somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people per year, 30 to 50,000. Just a couple of years ago, that number was 1 million a year. So we're talking about an unfathomable increase in the scale of migration. And actually, when my parents came to the country, the number of people coming legally was what the number of people coming illegally is currently, right? So we're just seeing an exponentiating curve on migration. And then we're also looking at the composition of that. You know, rather than it being medical doctors coming to fill skills gaps, if you look at what's known as the Boris wave, named after Boris Johnson, that was the 4.5 million people who came in about 4 years. Of those, just 17% came in on work visas. In terms of why I do this personally, look, I'm not a career politician. I came into politics just a couple of years ago when Nigel Farage said he was going to come out of retirement. And you know, I was born in Scotland. I was raised in the suburbs of London. I studied in London and then worked for a couple of American investment banks and then started my own tech company and sold it actually to an American bank not far from here. And So I looked at my life as someone who loves my country, feels deeply grateful, just filled with gratitude for the opportunities this country gave my parents and me, and saw that I felt like I could have some influence. I could, really do whatever I could to try and turn the great country of Britain around, the country that gave me everything. And that's what I've dedicated my life to doing. And, we've taken this startup insurgent party, Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage, from a party that had no MPs, from around about 13% in the polls to around 30% in the polls in the space of 2 years. We've led 350 national opinion polls. And if there was a general election tomorrow, in all likelihood, Nigel Farage would become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and I'd be the Home Secretary. So, we're on the right path. There's still a huge amount to do to both win the next general election, but then also, execution is everything. We got to work incredibly hard to make sure that we deliver if we do win. And it's not going to be easy, because what we've been left with as a country is, decades of total betrayal. The so-called Conservative Party, kept telling voters they were going to cut immigration down to the tens of thousands, and then imported 12 million people in 14 years. And the Labour Party is even worse. The speed at which things are deteriorating, and you're seeing that with your own eyes, and seeing obviously the Henry Novak tragedy, and of course the tragedy and horror of what you saw in Belfast. And I think, as you said in the last segment, the British people now are waking up to these facts and are willing to talk about them. For example, the proportion of the British population that believes that there is two-tier policing in Britain to the detriment of white people has doubled in the last 2 years alone, and I think that's only going to increase. So there are many problems in Britain, but what I will say is I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't believe there is still a path. It's a narrow path to victory, but it exists, and I personally believe that Britain can go from strength to strength if it only had the right leadership.
No, I think that's right. I saw a clip of you recently talking about actually shutting down a number of those worker visas from a variety of different countries. Talk to us about that policy, because if you came in as Home Secretary, you would be digging in on this. So what are some of those details?
Yeah, so look, we're very radical on immigration, and I think that's what's necessary. We spend a lot of time looking at the situation in Britain. So number one, we would announce a policy where if you come to the country illegally, if you're turning up on our beaches on a dinghy, instead of getting a free taxi to a free hotel and then, free healthcare and free welfare for life, you're going to be detained immediately and then deported back to the country from which you came. So that would be number one. Number two, we'll launch the biggest mass deportation program Britain has ever seen. And actually, as a percentage of the population, it would actually be bigger than anything that's even happened in America. So we would launch that too, to say that if you've entered the country illegally, there's not going to be any amnesty. We will uphold the law, and you won't be allowed to stay. Thirdly, as you've said, we've announced a red list for a host of countries, ranging from countries like Afghanistan, including countries like Sudan, which is the country, of course, from where the savage who tried to behead a man in Belfast came from. So, and that's not just work visas, by the way. That's any form of visa. But again, even when we're talking about visa bans, we need to remember that Britain is a country that essentially hasn't really had a border, certainly not an enforced one, right? So if you turn up on, this is how insanely broken Britain's immigration policy is. If you are a world-leading neurosurgeon from Washington, D.C., and you somehow do get a work visa to come to the UK, which isn't easy, even if you're that good, you have to wait at least 5 years, maybe up to 10 years, to get recourse to public funds. So meaning if you're made unemployed or something, to be able to get a welfare check. However, if you're a convicted murderer from Syria who turns up on our beaches illegally, do you know how long you got to wait to get recourse to public funds? No time at all. You get access to it immediately. And that's how insanely broken Britain's immigration
By the way, we used to have that in the U.S. That was called the Joe Biden presidency.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we've had the equivalent of that for north of 20, 25 years now. And the tragic part about that is most of the worst things that happened under the so-called conservative government.
No, and this is a huge problem for us as well. And the Bush administration is analogous to that here. Of course, very very close with the conservative government, Tony Blair, in the UK at the time. Talk to me a little bit about how, because for many of us, we interact with UK politics online, and so online, of course, Nigel, we know him, we've seen him quite a bit. We're starting to see your videos, really take off as well. But there's also the rise of this other sort of new party, Restore. So how does it work then? Obviously, a little bit of a different political system. How does it work then with their party and your party both running against Labour and against the Tories?
Yeah, so I'd probably say that's analogous to another party trying to be set up to sort of compete with President Trump's Republican Party. I mean, the biggest difference in the UK is that we don't have a presidential system. So no matter how brilliant or charismatic the leader might be, you need, in order to become prime minister, you need to win a majority of the 650 parliamentary constituencies in a general election. And you know, ultimately, there is a proportion of the British public that are behind the idea of secure borders and mass deportations and the upholding of law and order and British sovereignty and all the things that are close to our hearts. But, you know, ultimately, if those people are scattered across multiple, so let's say two parties or multiple parties, the result of that is simply going to be, you know, the equivalent of, you know, another 5 years of Joe Biden, as it were, right? Or probably something even worse than Keir Starmer. That's the scary thing. So probably the biggest thing I would say is it's not a presidential system. It's a parliamentary system. And, you know, Restore currently have one MP. Reform, if there was a general election tomorrow, you know, Reform have led 350 national opinion polls in a row. And if there was a general election tomorrow, it's a sensible assumption, looking at the polling, to say Nigel Farage would be the Prime Minister and I'd be the Home Secretary. Now that we're not taking that for granted, there's still a huge amount of work to do. But I think that's probably what the message I'd say is that, you know, ultimately we've got to focus on what the right prescription is. And I think if you look at the feeling among millions of people in Britain now, one of the reasons we've led for so long is because Nigel Farage has been talking about these issues actually for decades. You know, he's been talking about invasions. He did a big billboard and took a lot of flack for it at the time, talking about breaking point in terms of mass immigration. He's been talking about the grooming gangs for many, many years. So people know what Nigel stands for. And, you know, in the end, it's going to be for the British people to make a decision. But I think in order for us to get the change that we need, I do think this is the last opportunity for us to get a truly patriotic, common sense government that believes in those things, as I said, British sovereignty and secure borders. And, you know, if that doesn't happen next time around, I don't think there is a pathway back for Britain to be Britain in a way that we'd recognize.
No, and it may be unrecognizable. Well, I certainly cheers to your fight over there, to Nigel's. I'm very excited to be there in about, I think I'm looking at the date, about 1 month's time, I believe, CPAC UK, and I've done some videos about this that I'll be out there speaking as well as an American. I know that Nigel will be speaking, and I certainly hope to see you there too.
Looking forward to hosting you.
All right, and one last question real quick. Since you've been to D.C., have you been to Raheem Kassam's Butterworths yet?
No, but it's top of my list of things to do later.
Well, I know Raheem's watching because he's texting me throughout the breaks. Make sure you ask him this next. Thanks so much for coming on. Tell people where they can go to follow you.
On Twitter, it's @ZiaYousufUK, and on Instagram, it's Zia.Yusuf.
Cheers. Thanks so much for being here. All right, Jack Posobiec, Human Events Daily, driving on.
It's the Jack Posobiec Appreciation Hour. I can say confidently, I think Josh Shapiro would be the vice presidential nominee if it wasn't for Jack Posobiec. And that is, I'm being honest.
All right, folks, we're Jack Posobiec. We are back live here on Human Events Daily. Now, today out in California, very interesting that the Pacific Palisades fire, which we talk about quite a bit, it was huge in the news, that people don't realize that there was actually an arsonist who was arrested, this Antifa left-wing arsonist who was arrested and is currently on trial now for igniting that blaze. Now, to be sure, the mismanagement of Karen Bass played a major and massive role in all of that, but people don't realize that Jonathan Rinderknecht has actually, he was a former Uber driver, has now begun his trial, and jury selection is currently ongoing. Voir dire has begun there, and he's about to sit down and start his trial. And of course, we want to see everything. We want to see everything that comes out in that. But one piece that I wanted to remind folks of was the idea that when something like that happens, people don't always they don't always realize that when you're going through the insurance process, when you lose your home, when you lose everything, when your home burns down in fire, you're not thinking of every piece of paperwork, every document that you come up. And in fact, that could become a vector for fraud, and specifically for homeowners, because they know that you are in an extremely emotional situation. So I wanted to get Tom Simon on here from HometitleLock.com to kind of walk us through some of that. Tom, how are you?
Hey, great. So great to be here with you, Jack.
So, Tom, is my contention correct then that in a disaster situation like the Pacific Palisades fire, that, look, average people, we're going to be thinking, how can we help? What can we do to donate to charity? God forbid you know somebody who's faced. I actually do know someone who lost their home there, lost all of his children, lost all their belongings. Thank God that they were physically okay. But people don't realize that this also becomes a target for criminals.
Absolutely, Jack. And you make a great point, because when it comes to home title theft, there's two things that work here based on the example that you've given. One is the creation of vacant properties after a fire. People tend to not keep their eyes on vacant properties, both physically and in the home title system online at your county clerk's office. And that gives the bad guys an opportunity to go in there and steal that home title right out from under you by filing a false deed. The other thing is just the time and effort involved in kind of recovering from any kind of tragedy also means that maybe you take your eye off the ball when it comes to your largest asset, which is the equity in your home. So you're 100% right that both of these things are vulnerabilities when there's a tragedy like a fire that destroys neighborhoods.
And so in a situation like this, and I know that there were multiple frauds that occurred. And by the way, you might not even know. So, thinking about the home title lock where someone comes in and they change your home title to their name, you could even be in a situation, and if I have this correctly, where you're going to file an insurance claim, you've lost everything, and here come to find where the insurance company says, excuse me, you don't even own that property.
It's happened, Jack. I mean, most people don't even know that their home title has been stolen from them until months after it occurs, when the foreclosure notices start piling up in the mail. Remember, the bad guys who do this aren't doing this because they want to move into your house. They're doing this so they can sell the house out from under you, or go out and get a home equity line of credit using your house as collateral that they have no intention of paying.
So they have no intention of paying it. You're getting the collateral notices. Now, suddenly you're, my gosh, you've lost everything. You're faced with this. That's a huge problem emotionally, financially, economically for any family to have to go under. And so, look, when as a family, we have insurance. We insure our vehicles, we insure our homes, we have life insurance, right? We do all the things, health insurance, whatever else insurance I'm not even thinking of right now, but we have it all. But because that's what you do, because unfortunately we live in a real world, and in the real world, things do happen. And so that's what I've always kind of thought of home title lock as being. It's not insurance in the traditional sense, but it's just a way of knowing that if something like this were to happen, you're covered.
Again, you're right. It's not insurance, but I look at it like a smoke detector, something that you could just sort of set it and forget it. You hope that you never have to use it,
camera,
but
whatever.
It's there to protect you if something should go sideways, right? They have a $1 million triple lock guarantee where they're going to monitor the status of your home title. They're going to notify you if anything should happen. And if, God forbid, someone steals your home from you, they have a U.S.-based restoration team who's going to put that home back into your name, and they'll spend whatever it takes to make that happen.
No, that's incredible, because there have been times, and I know we've gone into it with some of these cases that come out, where occasionally the companies don't actually want to turn over the titles, even once they've been informed of the fraud. Why does that happen?
Well, again, the problem, the weak link in the chain here are the county governments in the U.S. and the recorder of deeds offices. They're not doing any underwriting to double check and see, is this request to change the title from one person's name to another person's name valid at all? By statute, in most places, they're not even allowed to do that. Their job is just to record the deed, whether it's real or fake. This reminds me of some of the things that people say in LA County when it comes to the way they hold elections, that, the paperwork is not being checked the way that it should. And that, God forbid, if someone who does have nefarious purposes wants to go over there and starts filing fraudulent paperwork, that if they're not,
actually checking with the original homeowner. And as you say, by statute, in some cases, they're even prevented from doing so. That creates real problems.
It totally creates problems. And imagine a situation where your home is stolen from you. Maybe the police are going to take the case. Maybe the FBI is going to take the case, but probably not. Most of the time, the law enforcement just says, hey, this is a civil matter. But let's imagine a world where the police and the FBI did their job properly in this type of situation and investigated it and even put the bad guy in prison. Law enforcement's job is not to restore that home back into your name. You're going to have to hire civil attorneys to do that. And and I know, Jack, that's not cheap. Attorneys cost money. Taking that off your plate with a product like Home Title Lock just makes sense. I do it.
No, we have it on as well. And so the idea then walk folks through that, let's say, they're not, they're not familiar with this type of thing. They have, in some cases, probably haven't even considered it. But as we know, that a lot of people's wealth, especially with interest rates the way they are right now, is locked up in their homes. And God forbid you go to take out a mortgage on that, or take out a second mortgage, or take out a loan based on that, and you come to find that you've got a problem with it. So if people want to get started, what's the best way to do so?
Well, so you go to HometitleLock.com, and the first step is just to sign up. And they, I think on your screen right now, there is a Human Events Live, or no, I'm sorry. I think we have a discount code for your viewers. But the first thing that happens, they just do a title check, and they get that to you for free just to make sure that you know where things stand right now. And then you can turn the product on if you want and kind of work on it on a subscription basis. It's totally worth it. People spend money putting security cameras in their houses. They spend money putting fire detectors in their houses. This is another thing. It's a detector for fraud.
So you can go on there. You can check it out. It's a way to just have this sort of set up. As you say, I love that line. It's a tripwire. It's like the smoke detector. Yeah. It's like that. It's like when you go to sleep, especially us, we go to sleep, we have our kids, I want to make sure that, God forbid, something happens, that I'm waking up, that I'm alerted as fast as possible. And, as dad, that's your responsibility. You got to be able to do that. But at the same time, if your family's wealth is tied up in your main assets, your real estate assets, you should be thinking the same way. And obviously that's, you're not going to, God forbid, lose your life over this, but you could lose your family's money, and it's very hard to get back. And in some cases, they don't get it back.
It's devastating. I mean, I was an FBI agent for 26 years, and I've spoken to a lot of people who suffered from this crime, and it's a really bad deal for them. And if they don't have any kind of protection like Home Title Lock, they're going to spend a fortune trying to restore this home into their name, if it works or not.
No, I think it's exactly right. So that the website, of course, by the way, it's HometitleLock.com. We have promo code POSO, the powerful promo code POSO. So if anyone wants to go there, it's HometitleLock.com/POSO. Anyone can go check it out. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Jack.
All right, incredible. So the Pacific Palisades suspect now on trial. By the way, of course, no one is talking about this, the fact that it was set by an Antifa arsonist Uber driver. It's a huge problem we have in conservative media. These things happen, and nobody wants to bring it up. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, you have my permission to lay ashore.